On a cold March morning, the body of a young woman was discovered in an abandoned garage on the outskirts of Queens, and this discovery would mark the beginning of one of the darkest investigations in the history of the New York Police Department. Detective Amy White parked her patrol car next to a barbed wire fence, behind which half-ruined garages were visible. The morning fog had not yet dissipated, and the gray concrete walls of the buildings looked particularly gloomy in the dim light. Her partner, Detective Paul Harris, got out of the car next to her, sipping cold coffee from a paper cup. "What do we have?" White asked Sergeant Robert Green, who met them at the entrance to the fenced-off area. "A homeless person found the body around 7 in the morning," Green replied, leafing through his notebook. "A woman, about 25 years old, African-American. She's in the third garage on the left. Patrol officers have already cordoned off the area." The detectives walked past several police cars with flashing lights and headed for the designated garage. Inside, it smelled of dampness and motor oil. In the corner, next to some old car tires, lay the body of a young woman. She was dressed in a black dress and high heels, as if she was going to a party or a meeting with friends. Harris crouched down next to the body, carefully examining the surroundings. His experienced eye immediately noticed the absence of any signs of a struggle in the room. "She wasn't killed here," he stated. "The body was brought here later." White nodded, making notes in her notebook. After 6 years of working together, they had learned to understand each other with half a word. She knew that Harris was already mentally piecing together a picture of what had happened, analyzing every detail. "Does she have any ID on her?" she asked. "Her purse is right here," one of the patrol officers replied. "Driver's license in the name of Sharon Michelle Davis, age 27, address in Brooklyn." While the crime scene investigators photographed the scene and collected evidence, the detectives examined the victim's personal belongings. Sharon's purse contained the usual women's accessories: cosmetics, keys, some cash, and a cell phone. There was no indication that robbery was the motive for the crime. "We need to contact her family," White said, putting away her notebook, "and find out when she was last seen." Sharon Davis's home was in a quiet neighborhood in Brooklyn, in a 2-story red brick building. Michael Davis opened the door after the second ring. He was a man in his 30s with traces of a sleepless night on his face. When the detectives introduced themselves and broke the news, his legs buckled, and he sank heavily into a chair in the hallway. "I called every hospital in the city," he said in a hoarse voice. "I thought maybe there had been an accident. But murder." Harris poured a glass of water from the kitchen tap and handed it to the distraught man. "Michael, we need to know everything about last night. When was the last time you saw Sharon?" Davis slowly rubbed his face with his hands, trying to collect his thoughts. "Around 7 in the evening. She was going to a friend's house, said they were going to watch a new movie and chat. Linda lives in Manhattan, so Sharon called a cab. I offered to drive her, but she refused, said she didn't want to bother me." "What was the name of the taxi service?" White asked. "I don't know." The detectives wrote down Sharon's friend's contact information and other important details. Michael said that he and his wife had been married for 3 years, had no children, and had no enemies or problems in the family. "Sharon worked as a manager at an insurance company," he added. "It was a quiet job with good colleagues. She couldn't have hurt anyone." Leaving the Davis home, the detectives headed to Manhattan to see Linda Brown. She lived in a small apartment on the 2nd floor of an old building in the East Village. Linda was a short, heavy-set woman in her mid-30s with short hair and a worried expression. "I haven't slept all night," she admitted, inviting the detectives into the living room. "When Sharon didn't show up and didn't answer her phone, I knew something had happened. She's very punctual, never late without warning." "What time was she supposed to arrive?" Harris asked. "We agreed on 8 o'clock in the evening. It takes about 40 minutes to drive from her house to mine, taking traffic into account. At 8:30, I started to get worried and began calling her. But the phone immediately switched to voicemail." White listened carefully to Linda's story, mentally reconstructing the chronology of events. Sharon left her house at 7 in the evening, was supposed to get to her friends by 8, but disappeared on the way. Tell me about Sharon. Did she have any problems, conflicts? Maybe someone was bothering her? Linda shook her head. Sharon was a very calm person. We've been friends since school, and I've never seen her argue with anyone. Even with Michael, they had a great relationship. They were planning to have children. After leaving Linda Brown's house, the detectives got into the car, and Harris tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the steering wheel. Something about this case seems familiar, he said slowly. White looked at him with interest. Over the years, she had learned to trust her partner's intuition. Familiar in what way? Remember the cases from 2022? The series of murders of young women who disappeared after getting into taxis? White frowned, trying to remember the details. 2 years ago, she had been working in a different department, but she had heard about the crimes. I think there were 4 victims in 6 months. Then the murders stopped exactly, and the killer was never found. I worked with Detective Anderson on that case. The pattern was similar. Girls would order a taxi, get in the car, and disappear. A few days later, their bodies would be found in abandoned places. Harris started the engine and headed for the police station. On the way, he recounted the details of the old investigation. 4 victims, aged 23 to 29, all African American. The murders took place between February and August 2022, then suddenly stopped. We checked all the taxi services in the city, Harris continued. We interviewed hundreds of drivers, studied the routes, but found no leads. It seemed as if the girls simply vanished into thin air after getting into the car. At the station, the detectives pulled a folder with materials from an old case out of the archives. Photographs of the victims, diagrams of the locations where the bodies were found, witness statements. All of this now took on new meaning in light of today's murder. The first victim was Keisha Williams, 23 years old, a college student. Her body was found in an abandoned warehouse in the Bronx. The second was Jasmine Wright, 25 years old, a nurse, found in an empty house in Queens. The third was Tamara Hill, 27, a teacher, found in an abandoned factory in Brooklyn. The fourth was Nicole Green, 29, an accountant, whose body was found in an old garage in Manhattan. They were all killed by strangulation, White noted as she studied the medical reports. No signs of violence, no defensive wounds. And they all ordered taxis before they disappeared, Harris added. But we couldn't find a common driver or taxi service. White put down the photos and looked at her partner. Do you think he's back? Harris nodded. Everything points to it. Same pattern, same method of murder, same locations for dumping the bodies. The only question is, why did he stop killing for 2 years, and what made him start again? The detectives spent the rest of the day comparing old and new case files. A computer program designed to analyze crimes confirmed their suspicions. The probability that the murders had been committed by the same person was 92%. By evening, the picture began to clear up. They were dealing with a serial killer who had suddenly stopped 2 years ago and now returned. His motives remained unclear, but his pattern of behavior was obvious. He preyed on young African American women who used taxi services in the evening. White closed the case file and rubbed her tired eyes. Ahead of them lay the difficult task of finding a killer who had already evaded justice 7 times. But now the detectives knew what they were dealing with, and that gave them an advantage. Harris put the photos back in the folder and looked at his watch. It was late, and the station was almost empty. Tomorrow we'll start by analyzing Sharon's phone records, he said. We need to find out what app she used to call the taxi and find the driver who picked her up. It had been only 4 days since Sharon Davis's body was found when detectives White and Harris received a new call. This time, the crime scene was outside the city, in an industrial area of Nassau County, where the body of another young woman had been found among abandoned warehouses. It took over an hour to get to the scene. Harris drove along the busy highway while White studied the initial information relayed by radio from the local police. The victim was 24-year-old Tiffany Jones, whose body had been discovered that morning by a security guard making his rounds at one of the warehouses. "Same modus operandi," Harris stated when they arrived at the scene and saw the body. "Strangulation, no signs of a struggle. The body was moved here after the murder." Tiffany was dressed in jeans and a light-colored blouse with comfortable sneakers on her feet. It looked as if she was going to a regular meeting with friends or just for a walk. Her purse was lying nearby, its contents untouched. A wallet with money and credit cards, cosmetics, a phone, and apartment keys. Local detective Roger Campbell, who was the first to arrive at the scene, approached his colleagues from the city. "Judging by the condition of the body, the murder took place last night," he said. "The pathologist hasn't arrived yet, but a preliminary examination shows the same signs as in your Davis case." White carefully examined the area around the warehouse. It was even more deserted than the garage where Sharon had been found. The nearest residential buildings were several kilometers away, making this an ideal place to hide a crime. "The killer knows the area well," she remarked. "It's no coincidence that he chooses such remote locations." While the forensic team worked on the evidence, the detectives went to the victim's family. Tiffany Jones lived with her mother in a small house in the Jamaica neighborhood of Queens. Gloria Jones met them at the gate. She was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and deep wrinkles around her eyes that immediately revealed her as someone accustomed to life's hardships. When the detectives told her about her daughter's death, Gloria did not cry. She just sank heavily onto the porch steps and sat there silently for a long time, staring at a single point. "I knew," she finally said. "When Tiffany didn't come home to sleep and didn't answer her phone, I knew something terrible had happened. She always lets me know if she's going to be late." Harris sat down next to the woman on the steps. "Mrs. Jones, tell us about last night. When was the last time you saw Tiffany?" Gloria slowly shook her head, gathering her thoughts. "Around 6:30. She was eating dinner in the kitchen and talking on the phone with a friend. Then she said they were going to meet at a cafe downtown to celebrate a mutual friend's birthday. I asked if I could give her a ride, but Tiffany said she would call a taxi." "Did she often use taxis?" White asked. "Quite often. We only have one car, an old one, and Tiffany didn't like to ask me to drive her when I came home tired from work. She worked at a bank and earned good money, so she could afford a taxi." The detectives wrote down the contact details of Tiffany's friends and all the details that could help with the investigation. Gloria said that her daughter had never had any serious problems, was not married, but had been dating a young man named Derek for 6 months. "Tiffany was a very cautious girl," her mother added. "After those murders 2 years ago, she always told me where she was going and never stayed out late without calling. That's why I was so worried when she didn't come back." Leaving the Jones family home, the detectives went to meet with Tiffany's friends. It turned out that she was indeed going to a birthday party for Carol Simmons, but she never made it to the cafe. Her friends waited for her for an hour and a half, calling her, but she didn't answer her phone. "We even thought about going to her house to check on her," said Carol, a 26-year-old nurse with a worried look on her face. "But we decided that maybe something had happened to Tiffany at work, and she couldn't let us know." The detectives spent the next 3 days analyzing mobile phone data, trying to determine which taxi service Tiffany had used. They also compared the victim's routes, looking for common patterns. The work was painstaking and often led to dead ends, but gradually the picture began to clear up. The Metro Cab taxi service database contained records of a call for a car to Tiffany Jones' address at 7:20 p.m. Driver number 734 was supposed to pick up the passenger and take her to the city center. However, when the detectives contacted the dispatcher, something strange came to light. The driver reported that no one was at the address, explained dispatcher Marvin Hall, looking at the records on his computer. He waited 15 minutes, then left. This happens sometimes. People change their minds or find another way to get there. "Who was the driver?" Harris asked. "Jerome Mitchell. He's been with us for 3 years. Reliable employee, no complaints." The detectives met with Mitchell the next day. He turned out to be a man in his 40s, short in stature, with a neat beard and attentive eyes. He gave a detailed account of that evening. "I arrived at the address at 7:35 p.m., the driver explained. "I parked near the house and waited for 15 minutes, but no one came out. I called the number listed on the order, but no one answered. I thought the customer had changed their mind, so I left for my next call." White wrote down his statement, but something about the story bothered her. "Did you see anyone else pick up a passenger from that address?" Mitchell thought for a moment. "No, the street was pretty deserted. Although, when I was leaving, I saw a car pull up to the house next door, but I didn't pay much attention to it." This was the first clue indicating that the killer might be picking up victims by posing as a taxi driver. The detectives returned to the station with a new theory, but before they could work it out, another call came in. The body of the third victim was found a week after Tiffany Jones's murder. This time, the scene was an abandoned factory building in an industrial area of Brooklyn. Crystal Williams, 26, worked as an administrator at a medical clinic and lived alone in an apartment in Park Slope. When the detectives arrived at the scene, they were met with a familiar sad scenario. A young woman in everyday clothes, no signs of a struggle, death by strangulation. Her purse with money and documents was lying next to the body, which ruled out robbery as a motive for the crime. "He's getting bolder," Harris remarked as he surveyed the surroundings. "This place is closer to residential areas, more risk of being seen." Criminalist David Roberts, who had worked on all three cases, approached the detectives with the preliminary results of his examination. Same method of murder, same marks on the neck. Judging by the condition of the body, death occurred late last night. No foreign fibers or other clues have been found yet. An investigation into Crystal Williams's background revealed that she led a quiet life, had no enemies, and no serious problems. She had been working at Dr. Henry Adams's clinic for 2 years, and her colleagues described her as a responsible and friendly person. "Crystal was very punctual," said her colleague Patricia Morgan during an interview at the clinic. "If she was even 15 minutes late, she would always call. But yesterday she just didn't show up for work and didn't answer her phone. We were very worried." A key breakthrough in the case came when detectives met with Jamal River, Crystal's boyfriend. The 26-year-old mechanic worked at an auto repair shop near his girlfriend's home and had walked her home after their date that fateful evening. Jamal was a tall, athletic young man with short hair and attentive brown eyes. When the detectives told him about Crystal's death, he couldn't believe what had happened for a long time. "We met at a restaurant downtown," he said, struggling to control his emotions. "Then I drove her home in my car. It was around 10 p.m. Crystal said she had to get up early for work, so we said goodbye at her doorstep." "What happened next?" White asked. "I left, but after driving just a block, I remembered that I had forgotten to give Crystal her scarf. I turned around and drove back. When I pulled up to her house, I saw her getting into a taxi." Harris leaned forward, sensing the importance of the moment. "Tell me more about that taxi." Jamal frowned, trying to recall the details. "It was a regular yellow cab like the ones you see all over the city. But the driver seemed strange to me. When Crystal got in, he didn't even turn to her or say a word. Usually drivers ask where they're going or at least say hello." "Do you remember what the driver looked like?" "Yes, I got a good look at him when the car drove past me. He was of average height, overweight, around 35 to 40 years old. Dark skin, short hair, no facial hair. He was wearing a dark shirt or t-shirt." This was the first detailed description of the suspect in the entire investigation. White carefully wrote down every detail, while Harris asked follow-up questions about the driver's height, weight, and distinguishing features. "Did you happen to remember the license plate number?" he asked. Jamal shook his head. "Unfortunately, no. It was already dark, and I didn't think it was important. If I had known..." He didn't finish, clenching his fists. "Are you absolutely sure it was a taxi?" White clarified. "Well, the car was yellow like all the taxis in town, and there was a light box on the roof with writing on it, although I couldn't make out which company it was. But now that you ask, It seemed to me that the driver was behaving differently from ordinary taxi drivers. At the station, the detectives immediately contacted a specialist in creating photo fits. Sergeant Marcus Gray had extensive experience working with witnesses and was renowned for his ability to extract the smallest details from people's memories. The process of creating the composite sketch took almost 3 hours. Jamal patiently answered questions, clarified details of the suspect's appearance, and made corrections to the image on the computer screen. Gradually, the monitor showed the face of a middle-aged man with full cheeks, small eyes, and a wide nose. "Yes, that's what he looked like," Jamal confirmed when the image was complete. "Maybe the nose is a little wider, but overall it's very similar." The finished photo fit was reproduced and sent to all district police stations, as well as taxi services throughout the city. Detectives also held a press conference asking the public to report any information about the suspect. Captain Denise Clark, head of the Homicide Division, called White and Harris into her office to discuss the investigation. "We have a composite sketch and a theory that the killer is posing as a taxi driver," she summarized. "What's next?" "We need to check all the taxi services in the city," Harris replied. "Maybe he really is a driver, or used to be. We should also look for used yellow cars that may have been converted into taxis." White added, "We are also looking into the possibility that the killer is stalking his victims in advance, studying their habits and daily routines. All 3 women use taxis regularly, which may have made them easy targets." Clark nodded. "I'm increasing your team to 6 people. I'm bringing in Detectives Johnson and Carter from the neighboring department, as well as 2 officers from the Organized Crime Division. This case is now our #1 priority." When the detectives left the captain's office, Harris paused in the hallway and looked at the sketch in his hands. "For the first time in this investigation, we have a face," he said. "Now we need to find the person that face belongs to." White nodded, sensing that the investigation was entering a new phase. The killer was no longer a faceless shadow. Now they had an image of him, a description of his behavior, and an understanding of his modus operandi. All that remained was to find him among the millions of New Yorkers before he chose his next victim. The search of taxi fleets began the morning after the composite sketch was completed. Detectives White and Harris divided the city into sectors and systematically visited all registered taxi services, showing the image of the suspect to dispatchers, mechanics, and drivers. They were joined by 4 additional officers, which sped up the search process. The first 2 days yielded no results. Many fleet employees studied the composite sketch closely. Some said the face looked familiar, but no one could positively identify the suspect. Detectives checked large companies in Manhattan and Brooklyn, several medium-sized fleets in Queens, but received negative responses everywhere. "Maybe he's working unofficially," White suggested during a short break on the 3rd day of the search. "Or using fake documents." Harris studied the list of remaining fleets. "We still have 12 small companies in the outlying areas to check. Many of them work mainly with private orders and may not check drivers' documents as thoroughly." The breakthrough came in the second half of the 3rd day at a small fleet called Night Ride Cab in an industrial area of the Bronx. The company was located in an old 2-story building with a dispatch office and a small auto repair shop on the 1st floor and a parts warehouse on the 2nd floor. The owner of the fleet, Ronald Cooper, a man in his 60s with a gray beard and tired eyes, initially looked at the sketch indifferently. Then his expression changed, and he looked more closely at the image. "Damn," he said slowly. "That's Eddie Martin." White's heart beat faster. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely. He worked for me as a driver for about a year. He quit 3 months ago, saying he found a better job. He was a quiet guy, no problems with him. No complaints from customers." Harris took out a notebook. "We need all the documents on Edward Martin, a copy of his driver's license, address, phone number, everything you have." Cooper walked over to an old metal cabinet and took out a folder with personnel documents. "Here's his personnel file. Edward Thomas Martin, 38 years old, address in Queens. He worked the night shift from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. He said he had other things to do during the day. White studied the copy of his driver's license. The photo matched the sketch. The same heavy-set, middle-aged man with dark skin and short hair. "Tell me more about him," she asked. "How did he behave? What did he talk about?" Cooper thought for a moment. Eddie was a very private person. He came to work on time, took orders, and fulfilled them without complaint. He hardly ever talked to the other drivers and always sat alone during breaks. He didn't say much, mostly just business. "Why did he quit?" Harris asked. "He said he got a better job with higher pay." I didn't ask any questions. People come and go, it's normal in our business. The detectives photographed all the documents and obtained detailed information about Martin's work schedule. It turned out that he had been working on the very days when the serial killer's victims disappeared 2 years ago. "I need information about all the orders Martin fulfilled during the last 2 years of his employment," White said. "I only have records for the last 6 months," Cooper replied. "I destroyed the older documents at the request of the tax authorities." Nevertheless, even this incomplete information was valuable. The dispatch records showed several orders to areas where the victims' bodies were later found. That was enough to get an arrest warrant. 2 hours later, the detectives were standing in front of Edward Martin's house in a quiet neighborhood in Queens. It was a small 2-story red brick house with a neat front yard. Nothing about its appearance suggested that a serial killer might live there. A SWAT team and 2 additional patrol officers were called in to assist with the arrest. White and Harris approached the front door, while the other officers took up positions around the house to block any possible escape routes. Harris pressed the doorbell. The house was quiet, but after a few seconds they heard footsteps on the stairs. The door opened and a man who matched the sketch appeared on the threshold, Edward Martin himself. "Mr. Martin?" White asked, showing her badge. "Detective White, New York Police Department. We need to talk to you." Martin instantly realized he was caught. Fear flashed in his eyes, then determination. Without saying a word, he slammed the door shut and rushed deeper into the house. "He's getting away!" Harris shouted into his radio. "Block the back exit!" The detectives kicked down the front door and stormed into the house. Martin was already climbing the stairs to the second floor, breathing heavily from excitement and rapid movement. White and Harris rushed after him, taking the stairs 2 at a time. On the second floor, Martin barricaded himself in the bedroom, but that only gave him a few extra minutes. The detectives broke down the door and found him trying to climb out the window onto the roof of the neighboring building. "Stop! Police!" Harris shouted, but Martin was already halfway out the window. He clumsily leaned out of the window, trying to reach the roof of the annex, but his calculation was wrong. Martin fell onto the concrete floor from the height of the second floor, crying out in pain as he fell. When the detectives went downstairs and out into the courtyard, Martin was already getting to his feet, limping on his left leg. He was surrounded by SWAT team members, but that didn't stop him. Seeing a gap between 2 police officers, he tried to break through to the fence. Sergeant Michael Rodriguez intercepted the fugitive at the fence. Martin resisted desperately, swinging his fists and trying to bite the police officer. It took 2 more officers to subdue the suspect and handcuff him. "Let me go!" Martin shouted, writhing in the officer's arms. "I didn't do anything! You're wrong!" "Edward Martin," White said, approaching the detainee. "You are under arrest on suspicion of the murders of Sharon Davis, Tiffany Jones, and Crystal Williams. You have the right to remain silent." But Martin wasn't listening. He continued to struggle and shout, insisting that the police were wrong, that he was innocent, that it was all a misunderstanding. Only when he was put in the police car and it started moving toward the station did he calm down a little. At the station, Martin was placed in a holding cell for 2 hours to recover from the chase and arrest. During this time, detectives obtained a search warrant for his home and conducted a thorough search of all the rooms. The search yielded striking results. In the basement of Martin's house, they discovered an entire room equipped as a kind of trophy room. On the walls hung photographs of all the victims, both known to the police and unknown. Under each photograph was a small plaque with the victim's name, the date of the murder, and a brief description. "My God," White whispered as she examined the wall. "There are photos of 13 different women here." In the corner of the room stood an old desk with notebooks containing detailed records of each murder. Martin had meticulously documented the entire process, from the selection of the victim to the location where the body was hidden. The notes contained the women's personal details, their addresses, habits, and daily routines. Harris leafed through one of the notebooks. He followed each victim for months, studying their lifestyles, choosing the right moment to attack. A yellow Ford Crown Victoria sedan with fake license plates and a homemade light box on the roof, imitating taxi equipment, was found in the garage near the house. The car had been thoroughly cleaned, but forensic experts found microscopic traces of blood and fibers from the victim's clothing. Once all the evidence had been collected and documented, the detectives began their interrogation. Martin was brought into the interrogation room, a small room with gray walls, a metal table, and 2 chairs. He still looked shaken from the chase, but he was no longer shouting or resisting. "Edward," White began, sitting down opposite the suspect, "we found a lot of interesting things in your house. Photographs, notes, a fake taxi. Would you like to explain what it all means?" Martin sat silently, staring at the table. His hands rested on his knees, his fingers nervously clenching and unclenching. "We know you killed Sharon Davis, Tiffany Jones, and Crystal Williams," Harris continued. "We have a witness who saw you take your last victim. We have your car with the evidence. And we have your recordings in the basement." Martin slowly raised his head and looked at the detectives. There was no remorse or fear in his eyes, only a strange calmness. "Ah, so you found everything," he said quietly. "I thought I had hidden it better." "So you admit your guilt?" White asked. Martin nodded. "Yes, I killed them. All 13 of them." "Tell us how it happened," Harris asked. And Martin began to tell his story. His voice was monotonous, devoid of emotion, as if he were describing a routine work procedure. "I chose young women who often used taxis. I followed them for several weeks, studying their habits. When they ordered a car, I would arrive first in a fake taxi and pick them up." "And what happened next?" White asked, trying to maintain a professional calm. "I took them to a deserted place and strangled them, quickly and quietly. They hardly resisted because they didn't expect to be attacked by a taxi driver." Harris leaned forward. "Why did you do it, Edward?" Martin thought for a moment, as if asking himself this question for the first time. "I liked the feeling of power over them. When they got into my car, they were completely dependent on me. They trusted me with their lives, and I decided what would happen to them." "Why did you stop killing for 2 years?" White asked. "It became too dangerous. The police were actively investigating the cases, and the news was full of stories about taxi driver killers. I decided to wait until things calmed down." "What made you start again?" Martin shrugged. "I missed it. Normal life seemed empty and meaningless. I needed to feel that power again, that thrill of the hunt." The detectives continued their interrogation for another 2 hours, eliciting details about each murder. Martin willingly recounted everything, sometimes even enthusiastically describing what he considered to be particularly successful aspects of his crimes. It became clear that they were dealing with a psychopath who felt no remorse for his actions. "Where are the bodies of the other 10 victims?" Harris asked. "In the woods, in Westchester County," Martin replied. "There's an abandoned sawmill there, and behind it is a small clearing. I buried them all in different places in that clearing. Can you show us the exact location?" "Of course. I have an excellent memory for such things." The next day, a large group of police officers, forensic experts, and sniffer dogs went to the location Martin had indicated. The abandoned sawmill was located in a remote part of the forest, several kilometers from the nearest road. Behind the dilapidated buildings was indeed a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. Martin, handcuffed and guarded by 4 officers, calmly walked around the clearing and pointed out the burial sites. His behavior was strikingly ordinary. He pointed out the graves as if he were giving a tour of a garden. "Here is Keisha Williams, the first one," he said, pointing to a patch of ground under a large fir tree. "And over there, near that rock, lies Jasmine Wright." The exhumation of the bodies took 3 days. Forensic scientists found the remains of all 10 women killed between 2021 and 2022. All of them were young African-American women between the ages of 20 and 30. "He operated according to a clear system," said medical examiner Dr. Susan Black as she examined one of the bodies. "The same method of murder, the same post-mortem injuries. A classic serial killer with an established modus operandi. DNA analysis confirmed Martin's involvement in all of the crimes. His genetic material was found on the clothing of several victims and in the interior of the fake taxi." The Edward Martin trial became one of the most high-profile cases in New York City history. The media covered the trial in detail, and the victims' relatives finally received answers to the questions that had tormented them for years. In court, Martin remained as calm as he had been during the interrogations. He recounted his crimes in detail, showing no signs of remorse. A psychiatric evaluation found him to be sane, but diagnosed him with a serious personality disorder. "The defendant exhibits classic signs of psychopathy," said lead psychiatrist Dr. Richard Stone. "Lack of empathy, inability to feel remorse, perception of other people as objects to satisfy his needs." The court sentenced Edward Martin to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on 13 counts of first-degree murder. On the day of sentencing, Detectives White and Harris sat in a cafe near the courthouse, reflecting on the most challenging case of their careers. 13 families finally got justice," White said, sipping her coffee. "That's what matters." Harris nodded. "And the streets are safer." Although I'm still amazed at his cold-bloodedness. Even in court, he talked about the murders as if he were describing his workday. "It's hard for a normal person to understand people like that," White replied. "The main thing is that we stopped him before he could do any more harm." Through the cafe window, they watched Martin being led in handcuffs to the prison bus. He walked calmly, without looking back, showing no emotion. Even now, when his life was ruined, he seemed indifferent to everything that was happening. The bus with Martin disappeared around the corner, and the detectives finished their coffee. New cases, new crimes, and new mysteries to solve awaited them. But this case, the case of a serial killer who preyed on women under the guise of a taxi driver, would forever remain in their memory as one of the darkest and most difficult of their careers. Captain Clark commended the entire team for their outstanding work in solving the series of murders. But for White and Harris, the greatest reward was knowing that they had made the city safer and brought peace to the souls of Edward Martin's 13 innocent victims.